Ethan Clarke had always considered himself a restless soul. At 24, with a camera slung around his shoulder more often than not, he carried the eyes of someone who wanted to capture the world before it slipped away. His best friend, Caleb Turner, couldn't have been more different. A year older, with the steady curiosity of a scientist, Caleb's backpack was stuffed not with camera lenses but with field journals, magnifiers, and a stubborn sense of adventure that sometimes bordered on reckless. That summer, the two of them decided to escape the buzz of their university town and head deep into the Rockies of Colorado. To them, the mountains promised something more than fresh air and rugged trails. They promised solitude, the kind of untouched quiet that could both soothe and unsettle a man. They'd grown tired of campgrounds filled with screaming kids and neon RV lights. They wanted wilderness. They wanted a place no one else had claimed. By the time they found it, a narrow clearing beside a cold mountain stream, they felt like they'd stumbled onto sacred ground. Towering pines swayed overhead, their needles hissing in the breeze like some ancient choir. The sky had already started to bruise purple with dusk when Ethan snapped the first photos. Caleb crouched by the water, laughing as he tried to balance a pot on uneven rocks. The fire pit they built was crude, a circle of stones glowing faint orange once the tinder caught. Above them, the stars began to appear one by one, pricking holes in the velvet dark. For a while, everything felt perfect. The hiss of the fire, the pop of resin, the occasional crack of branches shifting under unseen weight in the forest. Ethan brushed it off, probably a deer, maybe even a curious fox. Caleb teased him for jumping at shadows. They ate charred hot dogs off metal skewers and drank cheap beer straight from the can, like boys playing at manhood, trying to laugh louder than the silence of the woods around them. But there was a difference in the quiet here, one that neither of them could quite name. It wasn't the familiar hush of a park trail or a campsite buzzing faintly with other human lives. This quiet pressed in on them, thick and heavy, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Ethan tried not to notice how the shadows between the trees seemed to spread and deepen long after the fire was built. Caleb, oblivious, talked about tracking bird species and maybe finding caves to explore the next day. When the night settled fully, Ethan leaned back, staring at the silver scatter of stars overhead. He should have felt peace, but something else crawled at the back of his mind, a whisper he couldn't quite shake. This was no ordinary campsite. The air carried a weight, a presence. And though he said nothing, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't the only ones there. Morning came cold and thin, the kind of mountain air that stung the lungs and sharpened the senses. Ethan awoke to Caleb already crouched by the stream, scribbling notes in a damp notebook while steam rose from a battered metal mug. The fire had died sometime during the night, leaving only blackened stones and a faint smell of ash. They packed light for the day, just water, a few granola bars, and Ethan's camera slung over his chest. Caleb carried his small field kit, the scientist in him eager to catalog every bird call, every moss-covered rock. Their plan was simple: follow the stream upstream until the forest broke, maybe climb one of the ridges for a wide view. The woods grew thicker the farther they walked, the trunks crowding close together, branches clawing at their jackets as though urging them back. But Caleb pressed on, eyes bright, voice low and steady with fascination. Ethan trailed behind, snapping the occasional photo, though he found himself glancing over his shoulder more often than at the scenery. It was Caleb who spotted it first. Half hidden behind a veil of undergrowth, the opening gaped like a wound in the mountainside. Dark, yawning, cold. At first Ethan thought it was just shadow between the rocks, but when Caleb pushed aside the branches, there it was, a cave mouth, wide enough for a man to walk through without ducking. "Look at this," Caleb breathed, his voice somewhere between awe and triumph. "You know how rare it is to find one that isn't mapped or fenced off." Ethan felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. He didn't share Caleb's excitement. The cave's darkness was absolute, a pool of black that swallowed the daylight at its threshold. He lifted his camera, snapped a shot of the entrance, and winced at how small the flash looked against the void. Inside, it smelled of damp stone and something else, metallic, faint, like old blood. Caleb crouched near the edge, running his fingers over the ground. "Bones," he muttered, half to himself. Tiny fragments, brittle, scattered like gravel. He smiled, notebook already out, as though this were the most fascinating discovery of the trip. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "We should keep moving," he said. "Could be anything in there, bears, mountain lions. Hell, even people." Caleb only laughed, the sound echoing into the cavern and returning distorted, hollow. "Exactly, that's what makes it worth checking out." Ethan stood at the mouth of the cave, staring into the shadows. He swore just for a heartbeat that something moved deep inside, something pale, human-shaped, gone before he could blink. He lowered the camera slowly. For the first time since arriving in the mountains, Ethan wished they had chosen a crowded campground instead. The cave seemed to breathe. Every shift of the wind through the forest sent a low sigh curling out of its mouth, cold and damp, brushing against Ethan's skin like the whisper of a warning. Caleb, undeterred, clicked on his flashlight and stepped forward, his beam cutting a pale line across jagged stone. "Come on," Caleb urged, "just a quick look." Ethan hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but friendship tugged harder. Reluctantly he followed, his boots crunching over loose rock and brittle fragments of bone. The beam of light caught the glisten of something along the walls, scratches, long and deliberate, as if something sharp had been dragged through the stone again and again. Ethan frowned. They weren't the random gouges of nature. These were marks. Symbols maybe, he couldn't tell. The air grew heavier the deeper they went. It smelled wrong iron and rot, as if whatever had died here never fully left. Ethan's throat tightened. He swallowed hard, trying to ground himself, but the silence pressed too close. Then, from somewhere beyond the reach of their lights came a sound, a voice. It was faint at first, just a murmur carried on the cold draft. Ethan froze, heart hammering. Caleb, flashlight quivering in his hand, whispered, "Did you hear that?" Before Ethan could answer, it came again, clearer this time. A rasping, broken tone that seemed to crawl across the rock. "Get out!" The word reverberated through the cavern, bouncing back until it sounded like a chorus, dozens of voices layered on top of one another. Ethan's breath hitched. He wanted to believe it was the wind, a trick of echo, but every hair on his body stood on end. Caleb forced a laugh, though it cracked halfway out of his throat. Probably just someone messing around. Cavers, maybe, but Ethan knew better. He had grown up hearing stories of places like this, isolated holes in the earth where the desperate or the deranged made their homes. He thought of his camera in his hands, how useless it felt against whatever might be waiting in the dark. "Caleb," Ethan whispered, his voice urgent, "we need to go now." As if in reply, something scraped across the stone, metal on rock. Slow, purposeful. The sound was closer than before. Caleb's flashlight jerked upward, beam slicing through the cavern, and for a fraction of a second Ethan thought he saw it again, the pale suggestion of a figure retreating just beyond the circle of light. His stomach turned cold. Another voice rose, low and guttural, "Leave." This time there was no mistaking it. The sound was human, real and hostile. Ethan grabbed Caleb's arm and pulled. The two of them stumbled back toward the opening, boots slipping on loose stone. The cave seemed to tighten around them, every echo magnified into a roar. By the time they burst back into daylight, both of them were gasping like they'd surfaced from underwater. They didn't speak, not yet. Only the wind moved through the trees, rattling branches like bones. Ethan raised his camera, almost without thinking, and snapped one last photo of the cave entrance. Later, when he developed it, he would swear he saw a face in the shadows. But in that moment, staring into the dark void behind them, he felt only one thing, that the warning had been real. And whatever lived in that cave had meant every word. By the time Ethan and Caleb made it back to their clearing, the sun was already bleeding out across the horizon, turning the treetops into jagged silhouettes. The fire pit sat cold and lifeless where they had left it, but the air carried a tension that hadn't been there that morning. Ethan felt it in the pit of his stomach, the way an animal knows when a storm is about to break. At first, he thought they had wandered into the wrong spot. The camp didn't look the same. Their tent leaned sideways, half-collapsed, as if something had clawed through the fabric. The cooler was overturned, its contents scattered in the dirt. Ethan's breath hitched when he saw the color smeared across the canvas. Red. For one terrible instant, he thought it was blood. It streaked down the nylon in ugly drips, staining the earth below. Caleb rushed forward, muttering, "No, no, no," and pressed his fingers against the streaks. He held them up to the light. Paint, thick and sticky, reeking of chemicals. Ethan's pulse didn't slow. Paint or blood didn't matter. Someone had been here. And then he saw the words. Scrawled across the front of the tent in jagged strokes were 4 letters. Leave. The message bled down the fabric, stark against the pale nylon, impossible to ignore. Caleb let out a sharp, nervous laugh that didn't sound like him at all. Must have been some kids, right? Just a prank. His voice cracked on the last word. Ethan didn't answer. He crouched near the fire pit, scanning the ground. The stones had been rearranged, their careful circles scattered like kicked bones. He caught the faint outline of boot prints pressed into the soil, larger than his or Caleb's. The tracks led toward the trees, then vanished into the dark. A chill spread through his chest. Whoever had left that warning hadn't gone far. Night closed in fast after that. Ethan and Caleb huddled by the remnants of their camp, the ruined tent abandoned, the fire rekindled with shaking hands. Every crackle of the flames sounded too loud. Every snap of a branch in the forest made them both whip their heads around. Ethan tried to eat, but the food turned to ash in his mouth. Caleb paced in tight circles, flashlight trembling in his grip. The silence between the trees felt sharper now, like teeth. Then, faintly, almost swallowed by the wind, Ethan heard it again, a low chuckle, rasping human. His heart stopped. Caleb's light swept across the clearing, catching nothing but shadows. "Did you hear that?" Ethan whispered. Before Caleb could answer, something thudded against the side of their car, a dull, deliberate knock, once, twice, then silence. They stared at each other, eyes wide, the firelight painting their faces in flickering orange. Neither of them moved. The forest was listening. And somewhere out there, someone was waiting. The forest looked different when they came back. The path that had felt familiar only hours before now seemed foreign, crooked, as if the trees had shifted in their absence. Ethan slowed his pace as soon as the clearing came into view, and for a moment he thought they'd made a wrong turn. Their little camp, once neat, quiet, untouched, had become a scene of deliberate ruin. The tent sagged sideways, poles bent, nylon ripped open like a gutted carcass. The cooler was overturned, its contents thrown into the dirt, protein bars crushed into the mud, an apple flattened into pulp. The fire pit, carefully arranged the night before, was scattered wide, stones flung out into the grass as though something had tried to erase its very shape. But what made Ethan's throat tighten wasn't the damage. It was the color, paint. Splashed across the tent in heavy, dripping strokes, a thick crimson that glistened under the last light of day. For a second his stomach lurched and he thought it was blood. Then the chemical sting of it reached his nose. Paint, yes, but no less sickening. And written through the mess, 4 crude letters, leave. The word bled downward like a wound that wouldn't close. Caleb froze beside him. His hand, still gripping the flashlight, trembled in the air. He let out a quick, shaky laugh that was more fear than humor. Some kids has to be teenagers screwing around. Ethan didn't answer. His eyes tracked the ground, following the disturbances in the dirt. There were footprints larger than theirs pressed deep into the earth, not wandering tracks, not the random paths of hikers. These moved with purpose, circling the camp. Watching, waiting, he crouched by the fire pit. The ash from last night's flames had been scraped into the grass. Smudges of paint stained the stones, as though whoever had vandalized the tent had lingered, working slowly, methodically. This wasn't some prank dashed off in seconds. This was a message carved with time and intent. The air around the clearing felt wrong now, heavier, charged. Every sound from the woods carried sharper, branches creaking, the whine of insects, the distant rush of water from the stream. Ethan felt it in his bones. The forest wasn't empty anymore. "We should go," he said finally, voice low. Caleb shook his head, jaw tight. "It's just a warning, they're not here now. If we leave, it's like letting them win." "Win?" Ethan snapped, louder than he meant to. The sound seemed to ricochet off the trees. "This isn't a game, Caleb. Somebody found us. Somebody wants us out. And they're not just messing with gear.